Minds, My Favorite Murder, Dateline. If you're familiar with the names of any of these shows, you might be among half of Americans who reported consuming true crime content per NPR.
The true crime genre examines and reports incidents of violent crime, including ongoing cases. For content so shocking, why does it appear to have such mass appeal? Why do audiences continue to tune in?
Despite its recent rise in popularity, this phenomenon isn't anything new. From newer cases like Jeffrey Dahmer to stories as old as Jack the Ripper, we've obsessed over crime for as long as we could record it.
While the stories true crime depicts are admittedly fascinating, are they as true as they claim? Or have they been altered for increased entertainment? If so, how might this affect our perception of the real world and the justice system and our understanding of guilt or innocence?
True crime podcasts are becoming increasingly popular, with shows like Crime Junkie and My Favorite Murder have been criticized for desensitizing the issue. Is there a way to control this narrative without infringing on First Amendment rights? All of this and much more, right now, on That Point.
Good evening and welcome to On That Point. I'm Lauren Albano.
And I'm Sara, Creato. In the wake of recent public attention surrounding Gypsy Rose Blanchard's release from prison and subsequent social media debut, both true crime connoisseurs and critics alike have wondered, has fascination with the genre gone too far?
Is it ethical to make heroes out of victims or criminals in these highly publicized cases? With events like CrimeCon, a Comic-Con convention for true crime, what does it mean to be a, quote, fan of true crime?
There has been an abundance of shows representing true crime. People's interest with this particular genre has been kept alive due to the media's constant content. The genre has been deemed to be sensational as the severity of the genre gets mostly overlooked. Elizabeth Walters, a researcher in American studies with a focus in media studies, has done thorough research focusing on the film and TV industry. Her first published paper is about Netflix's true crime docuseries and the evolution of the true crime genre. Lauren sits down to interview her on the media's role in popularizing the true crime genre.
Thank you, Sara. I'm with Betsy Walters, a researcher of media studies here at Boston University. Thank you so much for joining us at On That Point today, Betsy.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You have presented a research paper about Netflix's true crime projects and the evolution of the true crime genre. With Netflix platforming documentaries and series on such cases as Jeffrey Dahmer, the Menendez brothers, and the Murdaugh family, do you think the company is ethical in its utilization of true crime for content?
Such a great question. I think, Netflix is heavily invested in true crime, and what's really interesting is that they were really in the documentary space, and then when Making a Murderer premiered in 2015, it was a phenomenon, and it really, from then on especially, Netflix is really committed to true crime, both documentary format and the, kind of narrative format like the Dahmer series. The ethics of it's a really interesting question because a lot of places do, build their brands around true crime in a way that Netflix does to a certain extent, but even, networks like, or, cable channels like ID or Oxygen, are all true crime. So it's interesting to think about the ethics of that and what that means. It's really hard because I know there were a lot of really legitimate questions posed against the Dahmer series, for example, and that a lot of that was sort of against the storyteller, Ryan Murphy, who created the Dahmer series, and his team that created that. So it's Netflix has to bear the weight of that too. Might not have been Netflix's, but they are creating and promoting all of these series, so these questions are going to come up.
So the true crime craze has also led to online discourse about whether certain committers should be absolved, such as in the cases of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, the Menendez brothers. So do you think this discourse is healthy?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that is relatively new to the true crime discourse, more so than in the past, is this question of what does justice look like? I think in the past there was a little bit more of maybe a cut and dried, this is the crime, this is who committed it. In the case of something like Unsolved Mysteries, help us solve the crime, or, here's what happened. And it was a little bit more of that kind of binary good and bad. And now I think a lot of what we think of as true crime is really questioning this idea of what does justice look like. Something like Making a Murderer or The Staircase or even, some of these trials, as you mentioned. And there's been some really interesting stuff about the Menendez brothers and kind of, what does, was justice actually served? Is our justice system flawed? Can it sometimes get it wrong or not allow for more nuanced understanding of some of these cases? That's something that I think a little bit newer is what true crime is doing. It's not brand new, but I think it's a little more nuanced in the way it's looking at it. So I don't think that's it's necessarily a bad thing. In some ways, it's interesting that it's kind of not so ideologically rigid. It's not so pro law and order in a way that's uncomplicated. It's actually asking us to say, well, what if this person didn't get a fair trial, or what if this didn't look like the way it was presented in court and the way we all saw it in the news at the time? What if it was a little different than that?
So how do the adaptation and broadcast of these stories impact family members of victims and other individuals connected to the cases?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's certainly one that has been thought of a lot in true crime recently. There have been a lot of adaptations and stories where they're really making an effort to make sure that the victims are not just a byproduct of the story, that it's not just about the murder, it's not just about the act or the violence or the gore, but it's about the victims themselves, that their stories are centered. They're seen as like kind of real people who lived and had these full lives and that aren't just about the moment of their death, for example. And of course, a lot of their families are very invested in that also. I know one example is Making a Murder, which is a show that I looked at, and the family kind of didn't want to participate in that because they felt that the series was sort of valorizing the person who has been convicted of their daughter's death, and justifiably they aren't interested in an angle that might be critical of that. So it's certainly an important question when thinking through the ethics of true crime, is that how are these victims portrayed, and remembering they were real people.
Yeah, and in terms of ethicality, do you know, are there any guidelines in place right now regarding best practices for telling the stories of these families?
That's a great question. I mean, as far as I know, there aren't really. I mean, I could be wrong. So but it does seem like it's pretty much on a storyteller by storyteller basis, that they kind of get to decide how they're framing it. And a lot of storytellers do talk about the care with which they're trying to tell the stories, but it does seem like it is very much based on how the person wants to approach the story they're telling.
What are the implications of true crime in the sense of whose story gets told or sensationalized? There is this idea of the perfect victim, which is usually seen as white women. Mm-hmm. So how do you think this influences public perception of true crime?
Well, I think the nice thing is that I feel like just as a culture and a society, we're tending to have more conversations around these things, around making sure that people aren't victimized again or marginalized, or that we aren't foregrounding certain people at the expense of others. I think that's a really welcome thing to be thinking about. Again, not to say that hopefully we see more victims of other, or just more diversity of victims, but just the idea that we aren't paying too much attention to certain groups at the expense of others. I mean, one of the most horrifying pieces of true crime I ever watched, not because of the act necessarily, but because it was about a serial killer who was allowed to prey on basically sex workers who were women of color. And in the police notes, I think it was written down as something like NPI, no person involved, of the women who were victimized. That's a horrifying thing to think about, is that any human being was not treated as a worthy victim. And I think, if anything, the fact that we're now kind of having these conversations around making sure that we're not, that every victim is treated as a person of value, and that if we are going to tell these stories, we should be telling them with care. I hope that is something that is progressing, and it's certainly something I see, and we do see a lot more true crime that not just is interested more in terms of victims, but even in terms of using true crime as a way to talk about these larger social issues, which again, not a new phenomenon. A lot of directors talk recently like they've invented this, like socially conscious true crime is a brand new thing they've just invented. It's not. It's always been very conscious of this, but when you can really build that into the story and tell a bigger story and critique society even more, I think that's a really useful way to use the genre as well.
That's all the time we have today. Thank you so much, Betsy Walters, for joining us today on That Point. You can find more of her published work at the journal Velvet Light Trap. Now to Jezelle Anim-Addo for a historical perspective.
It's evident that true crime has captivated the public eye today. But what about in the past? Is this obsession and romanticization a recent phenomenon, or have we always been infatuated by true crime? Whether it's the infamous story of Lizzie Borden, Ted Bundy, or celebrated ex-convicts like Gypsy Rose, the image of the outlaw has been glamorized and mythologized throughout history. Going back into the late 19th century, serial killer Jack the Ripper began his 3-year murder spree. In that time, the Ripper assaulted and killed 5 women in London. Despite his gory and nauseating actions, the world was obsessed with this killer. From the 19th century to the 21st, Jack the Ripper has been a household name. Rising literacy rates only increased his press coverage, which became more focused on entertaining readers rather than just informing them. The British press coined the name Jack the Ripper, further adding to his allure and cementing him in history. And as society changes, so do our perceptions of crime and criminals. But one thing remains the same: The public loves true crime. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence of interest in true crime stories with podcasts, documentaries, and books exploring the lives of infamous criminals. The case of Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, continues to captivate audiences decades after his execution. Bundy's charm, intelligence, and charisma have been mythologized, leading to a cult-like fascination with his persona. Newspapers covered every inch of this story, and the New York Post labeled him the Love Bite Killer, which added to the public fascination. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, Bundy has been portrayed in films and documentaries as a charming and attractive figure, fueling a dangerous fascination with serial killers. And throughout the time of the trial, many publications, including the New York Post, referred to Bundy's positive attributes by saying things along the lines of dresses in Ivy League clothes, flashes a warm smile, and never forgets his mother on Mother's Day. This narrative led many to believe that Bundy was innocent. Recently, Gypsy Rose Blanchard gained notoriety for her involvement in the murder of her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. Her story was depicted in the Hulu series, The Act, where she was portrayed as a sympathetic victim of her mother's abuse. Gypsy Rose's story is not the only one to be adapted into a popular TV show. Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy's violent acts have also been made into entertainment. With the rise of social media and true crime podcasts, there is no telling when the obsession will start to subside, if at all. And as society grapples with the ethical implications of glamorizing criminals, it's important to remember the victims and their families, whose lives were forever changed by these senseless acts of violence. Now to you, Sara.
I'm with Shira Diner, a professor and lawyer in the Defender Clinic at Boston University School of Law, and previously served as public defender for 17 years. Thank you so much for joining us today, Shira.
Thank you for having me. This is super exciting.
Yes. So, first question I'd like to start with is, there's been many recent studies that show kind of the impact of unconscious and implicit bias on jurors during criminal trials. And from your experience, what tends to make a defendant more or less guilty in the eyes of the jurors?
Oh, that's so interesting and such a great question. I think obviously our entire criminal legal system is premised on the idea that someone is presumed innocent, right? We all know that from watching TV, from, we sort of basic civics 101, that, the government has the obligation to prove that someone committed a crime. People walk in with, this presumption of innocence. Unfortunately, I think that most jurors, when they walk in and they hear that someone is charged with a crime, they start from the assumption that the person actually has committed the crime, or the person has done something else that sort of brings them into the court. So I think as a defense lawyer, the biggest challenge is to get the jurors and the judge and everyone else to see our clients as people, as human beings who, may not be perfect, but are just sort of trying like the rest of us to get through the day. And also, really trying to get them to understand that just because someone's sitting in this chair in this courtroom does not mean that they have done what the government says they have done.
And so kind of segueing into the topic of true crime, how do you believe that the consumption of true crime would impact this juror bias? Or maybe perhaps even with, witnesses that come forward, maybe impact their perception, perhaps?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first started practicing, it was before, I'm not that old, but it was before CSI, every place in the world, right? Before there were all, these podcasts and these shows, and there always have been crime dramas, but before there were so many of them. And they're definitely, I think jurors expect that the police in every case are conducting the same forensics that they do on TV, which they don't. The Boston Police Department, in most of the cases that the clinic students work on, are sort of lower level felony charges, and the Boston police don't take fingerprints, and they don't, do any of the fancy things that you see on TV, and they don't do a lot of the forensics testing that they would do in a more serious case. And it's something that we've been able to use to help explain why they shouldn't believe that this is the person who committed the offense that the police think that they did.
Even though there are these kind of negative impacts of the consumption of true crime, say with TV shows like CSI and NCIS over exaggerating the police protocol and that sort of thing, are there any positive aspects that you've seen with the popularization of true crime? And have you maybe seen these effects in the courtroom?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I think that I think people understanding sort of the possibilities of police investigation actually helps, because when it's not there and they see no forensic evidence in a case, they wonder, why is there no forensic evidence in this case, right? It's just become more talked about. What I think has been more of a game changer, and that has just sort of changed more people's opinions, is a lot of the sort of true crime podcasts and the like that are out there, where Making a Murderer is another example. There's been a lot of popular consumption of stories about wrongful convictions and about people who were identified, but then they couldn't have been the one to commit the offense. A lot of depiction, true story depiction about how police jump to conclusions. The first person they see is the person they narrow in on as a suspect, and then don't look for anyone else. There have been a lot of good depictions and true depictions of how police interrogate people and really force them to confess to crimes that they didn't commit, and that is becoming more and more prevalent in the sort of popular depiction of law and crime, both based on true cases and also based on made up Hollywood cases. And I think all of that has really helped shine a light on what police do, what police should do, and how that impacts the people who are accused of the crimes.
So the justice system can be very difficult to navigate and understand if you do not have a law degree. What are maybe some common misconceptions that, say, a person might have if they want to press charges about the justice system, say from maybe NCIS or watching TV shows? What are some common misconceptions that you see?
I think that most people believe that someone gets a lawyer as soon as they're arrested. They do not. You don't get a lawyer until criminal charges are brought against you in court. So police stop me on my way home and they arrest me. I could, it's now Friday at whatever time it is. I might not get to court until Monday morning. If I don't have the money to hire my own lawyer, to call someone to talk to me, I will not see a lawyer and not get a lawyer until Monday morning when I go to court. And what's happening to me between now and then, I'm in jail, police are asking me questions, I'm not at home, right? I mean, all this is happening and I haven't had a chance to have a lawyer yet. And this is something that impacts poor people and not people with resources, because people with resources are more likely to be able to call a lawyer who will then call the police station and say, you can't talk to my client, or they'll tell the person, here's what's going on, here's what the process is, where the person with no money who can't hire their own lawyer is just going to sit there until they get a lawyer, which again could be until Monday morning if it happens on a Friday afternoon. So I think that's a big misconception. I think people tend to really believe police officers and law enforcement at all, always. They don't want to think critically about what police do, because we want to believe that the police are there to help and that the police are, honest and doing a good job. And most police officers are, trying to do the right thing. But, so much of what happens is not what gets brought out in court. There's always so much more of a story than just what gets testified to at court.
Do you believe that true crime media can be utilized to inform the public on new policy or spread awareness about important social issues?
The public has definitely, in the recent years, been able to learn a lot more about sort of what has happened in real cases, especially cases, exoneration cases, where someone, was convicted of a crime, and then later evidence came up that showed they couldn't have committed the crime. And those cases and the stories in the media and the, sort of reenactments and the documentaries and the like on those cases give so much information, not just on that particular case, like what happened in this case, but it gives a lens to look at the whole system.
Thank you so much, Shira, for taking the time. I appreciate it a lot.
This was really fun. I appreciate your asking me to come talk with you today.
Despite its appealing nature, consuming true crime content can have damaging effects on its consumers. However, the genre continues to grow steadily within the media industry, backed by millions of dollars and even more fans.
These effects aren't limited to individuals either. True crime has made its impact in the courtroom on lawyers, jurors, and victims themselves.
And that's a wrap for this episode of On That Point. We'd love to thank our guests once more for joining us today. And as we say goodbye, make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at On That Point, and like us on Facebook. On behalf of our entire crew here at On That Point, I'm Lauren Albano.
And I'm Sara, Creato. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.